throughout the talk, just please do pop them in the chat. They're just at the bottom.
Oh dear.
We'll pick up them and we'll share them with Patrick at the end. All in all, it should last about an hour, but we'll unmute you so you can ask your question to Patrick once he's finished his talk. And yeah, we'll just sort of run through anything else afterwards. I guess in terms of your names, if possible, could you sort of make a note if you're an alumni, put your full name, or if you're sort of a parent or I guess a supporter of the college, just so that we have that to hand. But first of all, I hope you enjoy. I'm going to hand you over to Patrick now, but thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Could you just nod if you can hear me? Excellent. I'm really sorry about the delay in connecting with you. I'd like to say it wasn't entirely my fault, but anyway, I'm here. As Keith just said, I'm a very proud parent, not just of Ben Holden, my son, who's currently at AC, but also of Alice Holden, who attended AC around 20 years ago and was in part responsible for some of the developments in the valley at AC, particularly in relation to the polytunnel, and has been participating yesterday and today in another call looking at the possibility of doing much more with food in the future at AC and hopefully throughout the UWC network. Just a little bit about me. I'm a Londoner. My dad was a doctor, a child psychiatrist, and then he went back to general practice. I grew up in and around London, but I also went out to the California Bay Area when I was about 20. And this had a big impact on me. This is 1970, 71 at the time. And it seeded new thinking in me about greening and about ecology and about getting back to the land and about communities. And as one does when one is at a young and impressionable and headstrong age, we thought, well, let's just do it. So a group of about 6 of us bought a farm in West Wales and set up what was intending to be a self-sufficient farm community, practicing the principles of sustainable agriculture. And some 47 years later, as this all happened in 1973, we are still there. We're now the longest established organic dairy farm in Wales. We make cheese from the milk of our 75 plus Ayrshire cows. You can follow us on Havod Cheese, H-A-F-O-D, cheese, if you want to see pictures and films of the farm. And along the road, I picked up a lot of knowledge, mainly through practice, about whether it's possible to farm in a sustainable way. And the current news is it's still not as economic or as viable as farming in an unsustainable way, which is a bit crazy, and I want to go into that a bit more. So I've had a day job to help bridge the gap. I've worked for 20 years for an organization called the Soil Association, which is the leading advocate of organic farming principles and practice in the UK. But in 2010, I reached the conclusion that our work, though it was important, needed to be widened to a larger circle, because it seemed to me that we were heading towards a global crisis which connects up irreversible climate change, biodiversity loss, the depletion of natural and social capital, growing food insecurity, and at worst, a collapse, as described rather brilliantly in Jared Diamond's book of the same title, where he said that, you know, throughout human history, civilizations have destroyed themselves, very often by depleting their natural resources, then having a conflict after which there was a sudden collapse. And he uses Easter Island and Greenland and the Mayan civilization collapses as examples. But then he says at the end of the book, rather ominously, the next collapse is going to be global, because we've globalized just about everything. And so now if we have a 21st century collapse, it is going to be really catastrophic. And I think there's more than a little truth in that. And as COVID is now reminding us the latest shocks to the system, I think we are all having to rethink absolutely everything that was part of our lives in the past and redesign it for the future. And so click on food and farming, And that is what I wanted to talk about today, because it seems to me that we do indeed need to build back better food systems which are resilient, which address climate change, which address the biodiversity crisis, and which enable us to look after the planet and indeed its population and our children and future generations in years to come. And I believe that although right now, as we speak, the food systems are really part of the problem, most of the food we eat and buy is produced in industrial ways, in ways which are effectively an extractive industry. You can't blame the farmers, they're just selling commodity crops at or below the cost of production. And they're trapped into this by an economic spiral where the polluter doesn't pay, and the subsidies where they exist are going to all farmers and not in any way favoring the farmers who are using more sustainable methods. And it's now really got to a crisis point where, with Brexit, which I was strongly opposed to, I'm sure that will come as no surprise, we're now, weirdly enough, we're redesigning our agricultural policy in the UK, and it just might be that one of the opportunities resulting from Brexit is to start to redesign the policy framework which shapes farming practice in such a way that sustainable farming could be rewarded and unsustainable farming made uneconomic. And the simple way to do that will be to make sure that those farmers or farming systems which are causing damage to climate change, to pollution, to emissions, to biodiversity, are made accountable financially for the damage caused. That, of course, is the application of the polluter pays principle. And then in parallel with that, the support which is available currently in the UK and throughout the European Union, of course, which pays farmers about £80 an acre, more or less as a social security payment, just for not breaking the law in farming, could be redirected so it rewards sustainable farming practice. And as we speak, literally today, I've been in the privileged position of having the ear of the architects of the Welsh farming policy review. And it just might be that Wales is the first country in the world, literally the world, to redesign its farming policy incentives to support regenerative farming, farming which builds soil fertility, which increases farm biodiversity, which works in harmony with nature, and farmers who adopt those practices not round the edge of their otherwise intensively farmed land, but right across the farm, will get proper rewards for those activities, whereas farmers who are causing problems with these mega dairy farms with cows that never get out, or poultry and pig units, which really ought to be banned because of their welfare abuse and overuse of antibiotics, those farmers will not benefit from the support which will be on offer when this new package is introduced. So this is a really exciting moment. And I suppose to give it AC context, it seems to me that the United World Colleges, and perhaps AC in particular, there's an opportunity here, because AC is blessed with a farm, but also the valley, and a huge and growing interest amongst the students, it seems to me, in adopting more sustainable lifestyles. And obviously, the young people at AC are going to be the emergent leaders of the future. And I think in the past, food and farming has not really been seen as a career option or something which is relevant to people who are going to be in leadership positions. But this must change, because if we are going to enable this transition away from the predominantly industrial systems which exist at the moment, this needs to be top-down, science-led and policy and research supported, and of course citizen-led, because politicians, whichever political persuasion they are, rarely act unless they're feeling the electoral pressure. So this is a change which needs to mobilize the whole population. And above all, it does need leadership. And it seems to me that people who are thinking of themselves as world citizens, wishing to serve the communities of the countries where they will go back to, if they do go back to them, this is exactly the role that UWC could play in preparing these emergent young leaders to play their role in this huge global transition which is needed. And just to put some flesh on that, I heard a talk given by Dr. Vandana Shiva, who's a wonderful Indian campaigner in London last summer. And she said, you know, when it comes to climate change, it used to be about saving the rainforest and the last areas of pristine wilderness. But now, if you think about it, what is the main land-based activity on all the inhabitable areas of planet Earth? It is farming, because most of these wilderness areas have gone and they've been replaced by farms, small or large. And so if we're going to repair the damaged lungs of the planet, and indeed its digestive system, which is its soil really, we have to change farming, and we have to change it on a small scale with the farmers who still constitute about 70% of the world's food production, the small farmers in so-called developing nations, which are really in many ways more developed than we are these days because we've trashed so much of our natural and social capital. But it also needs to be on the big farms as well. And unless we do that, and unless we do it in the next 10 to 20 years, we may indeed have an unlivable planet, a planet where its capacity to support human beings on the scale that currently exists will be massively diminished. Now, the question arises through all this, can we achieve this? Is it possible to feed a peak population of 10 billion or whatever it's going to be with a switch to sustainable food systems? And the answer is, I believe it is, and I can say that with some conviction from my 40 plus years of experience of sustainable farming. But of course, it will mean that if we're going to achieve this, we will have to change our diets. We will have to align our future diets with the productive capacity of the farms and the farming systems, which will replace the ones we have at the moment. And this will mean, it won't mean, by the way, giving up eating all livestock products and switching to a vegan or vegetarian diet, unless we have ethical objections to animal production. It will mean giving up our addiction to the cheap and unacceptable livestock products from industrial poultry and pork systems and mega dairies, which we are eating vast quantities of, and switching to, this may surprise some people listening to this, to livestock products from ruminant animals, mainly ruminant animals. This means cattle and sheep and grass-fed, by the way, not grain-fed, but grass-fed and mainly grass-fed cattle and sheep systems, and mainly grass-fed dairy systems such as mine declare an interest. And the reason for that is because although these animals emit methane, the calculation of the methane emissions from ruminant animals, cattle and sheep, has been vastly overestimated by the Food and Agriculture Organization and by many other learned academic communities who have published very authoritative and influential reports on future diets over the last few years, notably the Eat Lancet report, which said we should move to a mainly plant-based diet. Well, the news for you, from me, and obviously you need to check this out, is that the science upon which those reports were based was flawed. The methane calculation was flawed, and most of the authors didn't understand practical agriculture from the ground up. And if we want to eat what is healthy for us and sustainable for the planet, we need to align our future diets to the productive capacity of the farming systems which need to replace the ones that we're practicing at the moment. And the Sustainable Food Trust, my organization, is in the process of putting together a modeling exercise which will calculate the total food output of a United Kingdom switched entirely to sustainable production methods. And to do this, we have to divide the farming regions, the farm academics call them typologies. You know, you can't obviously produce crops on the top of Ben Nevis, etc., etc. So you have to work out how many different farming systems could be deployed in a sustainable way on a sustainably farmed Britain, and then work out the yields from those farms in the different crops, and then divide that by our population. And that would be the best diet that we could eat if we wanted to align our future diets to sustainable productivity. And the headlines are, in anticipation of the publication of this report, We'd give up eating all the cheap and industrial white meat. We'd eat more, probably more, grass-fed and mainly grass-fed lamb, beef, and dairy products. We'd eat a lot more vegetables, of course, because vegetables can be grown very efficiently, but they do, in most cases, need some livestock to support them through the composted manures, but not exclusively. I can think of some excellent non-animal-based organic vegetable producers. And we can eat grains, of course, and that will be the prescription for the United Kingdom. In other countries, it will be different. In fact, every country needs to align its diet to the productive capacity of that particular part of the planet. And the exciting thing is that I believe young people are very interested in these ideas, are very engaged with them, want to play their part, not only as eaters and as consumers of food, but also as citizens, and hopefully, in the case of UWC, as leaders of this change, which I believe must take place. And just to finish, and I'll open it up for discussion, one of the initiatives that we've been pursuing literally over the last few days, with the full support of the first female president of the National Farmers Union, Minette Batters, is the idea that at the COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, we should have an event which would be akin to the Paris COP21 summit on climate change, but instead of general climate change, it should be a COP for food and agriculture. And there's no reason why our Prime Minister, if we can get this message through to him, and we're doing our best, should not announce the leadership of the United Kingdom in launching an initiative whereby all the countries of the world would commit to a transition to sustainable food systems operating within planetary limits, and that trade in food, which is a very contentious subject at the moment, should be restricted only to food which is produced in a sustainable way, which meets climate reduction, emission reduction targets from farming, and that all the nations of the world would also commit to measuring the impact of their collective farming systems with common and harmonized metrics, which is a project which we are also working on. Now, it may seem a little bit far-fetched to imagine that at this late stage, the COP26 could be a stage for the ideas that I've been sharing with you, but I do think it might just happen, and we'll see. So I'll pause there, and I think, is that about 20 minutes, thereabouts? And there's lots more I could say, but maybe it's more interesting to have an exchange about it. So Keith, do you want to you've been following the chat, and I've been ignoring it, not ignoring it, but I can't multitask.
No problem. I think the opening question comes from Sophie McFadden. Let me just unmute her. A bit of trouble to unmute. Sorry. Hi, Sophie, can you hear us?
Yeah, no, I just wondered what your views were on the present agricultural policy that's going through. This is very UK centric, but it's quite interesting given Brexit and leaving Europe.
Yes, well, to those of you who are not UK centric, apologies for this, but basically the agriculture bill was voted through the House of Commons a couple of weeks ago and is now going to the House of Lords. And there's been a huge debate about the trade deal, which will have to be done with the US and others in this post-Brexit world. And the risk is that in order to negotiate a very good trade deal for trade in machinery and industrial stuff, agriculture will be the pawn in the game. And so the government have been fiercely resisting any clauses in the agriculture bill to restrict trade from America, in particular, in chlorinated chicken and other environmentally and welfare undesirable products. And the government steamrolled the bill through because it's got such a massive majority, although some Tory MPs did rebel, and it's now going to go to the Lords. So this really is the risk that at the moment, I'm just saying, what does sustainable mean? Yes, I'll come to that in a moment. That's a very important point. At the moment, we are going to move into an era where there'll be sort of unrestricted international trade, which will mean that farmers in other countries who are farming to lower standards than we are will be able to export their crops, whether it's genetically modified soy or chlorinated chicken or whatever. And us hapless citizens, unless we can tell the difference in the supermarket, will be forced to eat them. That's the kind of nightmare scenario. Now, what I just said at the end about the COP26 is that if we did this deal, then trade in those products would be unallowable because it would be not meeting climate emission reduction targets. And that comes to the question of how we define sustainable. It's an important point because there are many terms being bandied around at the moment about sustainable agriculture: agroecological, organic, regenerative, etc. So what we need to make this thing work is an internationally harmonized agreement about what sustainable agriculture really means. And we've been working on this at the Sustainable Food Trust for the last 4 years. What we've done is we've developed a Farmers and Land Managers Working Group, a framework of categories and metrics, which include obviously the productivity of the farm, but then adjusted for its impact on the natural and human capital. So soil, water, biodiversity, nutrient cycling, livestock and crop husbandry, obviously, and the social and cultural impacts, all of which have metrics to measure them. And this is the sort of scheme which the Welsh Government are going to introduce. So in other words, they're going to reward sustainable agriculture, but each year, all the farmers who participate in the scheme will have to do an annual audit, an annual sustainability audit, which will require them to capture all these metrics. And then the government can measure its progress against the emission reduction targets, hopefully set by the COP26. How do we bring the supermarkets on board? I just saw that question. Very good question. The supermarkets seem to be a law unto themselves, but in fact, they are entirely vulnerable to their customers. If their customers change, we change. If we go into a supermarket today and we try to buy food with good provenance, with a story that we know, that produced by a farmer that we've met or whose identity is visible, let alone with labeling about exactly how sustainable the production system was, we'll go out with our trolley empty because it's incredible how little of that information is currently available to us. However, if we go into our local supermarket and we ask these tough questions, we want to only buy food which is sustainably produced. Can I expand my criticism, Eat Lancet? Yes, I will. And we take our custom elsewhere if we don't get satisfactory answers. The supermarket boardroom, within a week or two, if enough of us do that, will be discussing what they can do to respond. But at the moment, they see local and regional food as more or less a luxury that they can, have tokenistic representation and not much more. But if enough customers start to get informed about wanting to use their purchasing power as consumers and citizens to buy their food with a different story, then they will have to change, or they'll go out of business. Another thing I think we can do is that we can support farmers markets, local farm shops, community-supported agriculture projects. There's and also, of course, direct sales with internet-based sales, which is really a big emergent trend now in shopping. So use your buying power. It's about £2,000 a year per citizen or something like that. If all of us did that, and all of us bought 50% of the food we buy, the staples, from local farmers, then that's an enormous force for change. Just a quick point on the Eat Lancet report. The Eat Lancet recommended a plant-based diet, but it recommended a global diet, which was basically very, very little meat at all, and a tokenistic amount of red meat, but 4 times as much chicken and a splash of milk. And that might be appropriate for some countries, but it's certainly entirely inappropriate for the United Kingdom. So one of our key criticisms of the Eat Lancet report is that it didn't differentiate between the different countries, and it also didn't differentiate between the livestock systems which are part of the problem and those which are part of the solution.
Brilliant, thank you. We also had a question coming from Michael Klein. I'll just unmute him. Michael.
Yeah, hi, it's Michael here. I just want to know how this good idea. How are you going to sell it to the large agricultural exporting nations like the US and Brazil? I mean, how are they going to join? Why are they going to join?
That's a very good question. Well, I suppose one answer to it is that there are many countries in the world that cannot be self-sufficient in food. The United Kingdom is one of them. We can only produce around 50, maybe 60% of our staple foods. I would think probably more, actually, if we really put our minds to it. But countries like Japan, I think, are 80%, and South Korea are hugely dependent on food imports. So it's not to say that there will be no world trade in sustainable food after this new world order comes into place. It's to say that we really can't afford to trade any longer in unsustainable food because it's trashing the planet. So I'm not anti-trade. I mean, you know, let me put my cards on the table. We produce cheese, and quite a lot of it is exported to the United States and Australia, which may seem rather strange, given that I'm so committed to local selling. And one of the reasons for that is because we're producing rather inexpensive cheese because of the absence of the polluter pays principle and the misdirection of subsidies. We'd love it all to be sold in Wales, but at the moment we can't achieve that. So we're ending up exporting. It's a bit like we're the sort of whiskey category of cheese, if you see what I mean. So I'm not ashamed to be, I'm rather proud to be exporting cheese, but I do think there will be such a thing as ongoing trade in food, but the wrong sort of trade is what we need to stop.
Brilliant. Molly also popped through a question. Would relying on only grass-fed meats and no longer using intensive meat production methods not make meat unaffordable to many families? What would you do to keep meat affordable to all?
Well, that's a good question too. It is true that if the policies I'm advocating were introduced, the price of food in the shops, certainly the food which is very cheap, dishonestly cheap in my view, would go up. But you should remember, I don't know if you can see the picture just behind me there, it says the hidden costs of UK food. The Sustainable Food Trust produced a report 2 years ago called The Hidden Costs of UK Food, and the headline conclusion of it is that for every pound we currently spend on food, it could be dollar because it's the same everywhere, there's another hidden pound in costs which we are already paying, but in hidden ways. So for instance, and they split about 50-50 between damage to public health and damage to natural capital and pollution of the environment. And then there's of course another one which we're not yet paying for, which is climate change. We should be paying. So actually we have a dishonest food pricing system. The food seems apparently cheap. It's not cheap at all. It's costing us our existence on the planet and our own health. And so I think this discussion about price is important because food, good quality, nutrient-dense food ought to be the right of every citizen. So governments have a responsibility to step in if there are sections of society for whom affordability of food is an issue. But we can do that. I mean, there are food stamps in America, and we can have an equivalent system here. And indeed, we already do. And there are food banks, which is a bit of a disgrace, really, that we have to rely, well, so many people are having to rely on food banks at the moment. But I think we need to be honest about the real cost of food. And if it does have to cost us more, by the way, it's under 10% of the average disposable income is now spent on food, whereas 30% in the 70s. So if we have to spend a bit more of our income on food, so be it.
Yeah, thank you. Next up, we have Rebecca. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi. Sorry. Yeah, I was wondering. Thank you first of all for your talk. I was wondering who do you see as your main allies to get this wonderful vision for COP26 realized?
Well, a couple of years ago, I would have said the farming organizations would have been against it, but now I think they're all for it. It's amazing. I mean, there are thousands of farmers all over the UK now who really would love to switch their farming methods to be more harmonious and sustainable and nature friendly, but they simply can't because it doesn't pay well enough. So I think you'd have the vast majority of all the farming organizations behind this proposition. And we're just currently in discussions with WWF and RSPB, who I think ought to join this. I mean, why would they not be keen on this? And then, of course, there's organizations like CRWF, Compassionate World Farming. They ought to come behind it, and I think they will. So I think there are a large number of allies, but really what we need to do is to get into what sometimes is called Middle England, you know, the people who wouldn't normally be the people who would support this sort of thing. But the Daily Mail readers, or however you want to define them, the people who, for whom probably cheap food is seen to be a good thing. But I reckon that most people, if you share these arguments with them, they'd agree. It's just they don't have the information. So I think that everybody's an ally with this, because who doesn't want a livable planet, and who doesn't want to eat food which is going to make them healthy? And by the way, this is an interesting factoid. The nutrient density of our food since the Second World War has declined incredibly. Food is not as nutritious for us today as it was 50, 60, 70 years ago. And that's because of the use of chemical fertilizers and other modern methods of farming. Did you know that if you go into a supermarket and you buy a salad, unless it's organic, it will have been grown in rock wool hydroponically with chemical nutrition, no longer in the soil. And that's all the salads in all UK supermarkets. I bet you didn't know that. You know, there's a lot of things going wrong with our food system. So that a wonderful food campaigner who's a friend of mine, a man called Eric Schlosser, who wrote a book called Fast Food Nation back at the beginning of the 21st century, he said, you know, if we knew the true story behind much of the food we eat, we wouldn't want to buy it. And that is the truth.
Brilliant, thank you. Next up, we have Peter Dillon. Let me just unmute. Hi, Peter, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I should just a moment to give a background. I'm Peter Dillon. I work in youth in agriculture in the Caribbean. We start youth-owned workers' cooperatives. So I come from a slightly different but parallel place on this. My question is that I've worked in sustainability in agriculture for 20 years. The single biggest challenge that we have in sustainability is the demographics. That we can get the science right on it. We know that. But the issue we have is the demographics of agriculture worldwide are that old people are leaving agriculture, and young people, as much as they may profess to be interested in sustainability, are not going into agriculture. And so I would ask, how do we work with this? Because we have yet to come up with an answer. And without demographics changing and without young people going into agriculture, nothing will change.
I completely agree. I think that's a wonderful point and really critical challenge. And I think the answer is that we have to change the social, economic, and cultural status which society attributes and ascribes to people who work in food and on the land. At the moment, it's an awful thing to say, but we rely on an economic underclass to grow and package most of the food that we eat. It's a terrible thing that it's come to that. It's an embarrassment, really. It's a shame on us for allowing that to happen. But I reckon, and maybe in the Caribbean, this isn't quite as advanced. It's only just starting to really affect us here. There's a whole generation of young people who are rethinking all these issues and who are now actively thinking about a career in food and farming. We are on the receiving end of some of this interest on my farm. We have very well qualified PhD students. In fact, funnily enough, we had a very well qualified young man just email us today saying, can I come and work on your farm? I think there are many thousands of young people now who are reconsidering what quality of life means, what meaningful existence means. And if we can offer them a reasonable living wage, better than a living wage, hopefully, but a quality of life which reconnects with nature, which works in harmony with nature, and which delivers well-being and societal respect, I think we would have many, many young people giving up city life, especially after COVID, which has been such a tremendous shock and has made us realize we don't have to go to an office and work every day, and get back to the land, as I did. So I'd like to think of myself as the advanced guard of but of the global back to the land youth movement. We'll see, but you know, I think there's something stirring out there, and I would imagine that in the Caribbean the same thing will happen too. And access to the land, I see this, yes. I mean, access to the land is a huge issue. There's the capital barrier. I mean, I spent 30 years as a tenant and then a partner, and it took me, you know, until I think I'd been on the farm 35 years before I borrowed the money to buy it from an ethical bank. So we need to give a lot of attention to that issue. There's another question I just saw flash by about food processing. Obviously, food has to be processed. I mean, bread is a processed food, but it wants to be processed appropriately. And also the infrastructure that we need to process local food needs to be recreated, because so much was disappeared during my farming lifetime. I mean, nearly all the food you buy in supermarkets now is produced on very few, very large farms, and is processed centrally and packed centrally and killed centrally. There's an abattoir in Llanybother in West Wales which kills all the lambs for Sainsbury's. They even come from the north of Scotland to go there. That's a terrible thing. We ought to have more small abattoirs. We need to redistribute and relocalize our food systems. That includes the processing infrastructure. And we, in the global community, the leadership community, including AC and UWC, can be leaders in that change.
Great, thank you. Next is Kevin Harrington. Let me just unmute 1 second. Hi, Kevin, can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry, I asked my question earlier about the supermarkets and it's been answered. I did it on the chat facility.
Okay, oh no, because I think you've had a second question about, I'll just read out. Will your analysis of what the UK can produce, with your analysis, sorry, will you identify gaps in provision that might create opportunities for farmers to fill?
Yes, I think it will be characterized by a return to mixed farming, which, by the way, will require a lot more people working on the land. I think there'll be particular demand for vegetables. There's a wonderful vegetable producing operation just near me in West Wales, a place called Blind Camel Farm. You can visit their website, which I think is probably the global model for the way in which we can produce and buy our vegetables in the future. Peter Seger, who runs it with his partner, Anne, said if we had 200 blind camels, we could produce enough vegetables for the whole of Wales. They are supplying farmers markets in Cardiff and Haverfordwest and Swansea. But actually, we need more of those blind camel operations. And he employs an incredible number of people. I think it's 8 on 45 acres. So, you know, there it is. There's the model for the future. And my darling daughter, Alice, I'm not sure if she's listening to this, she grows vegetables in Dagenham in the east of London. And she's part of a project called Growing Communities. And she did one of the workshop things that AC does every year, just earlier in the spring. These new models of growing food with lots more people and diverse enterprises, they're really life affirming. And I do think there are big opportunities for entrepreneurs who want to lead in the development of relocalized food systems.
Brilliant, thank you. Next up, we have Marguerite. Let me just unmute. Hi, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. I work for the Norwegian poultry producers, so this was an interesting talk in terms of protein, because as not a lot of people know that. I mean, what you said about grass-fed ruminants, I completely agree with you. That is important. But then you have the poultry who can take advantage of grain that can't be eaten by humans, and that the pigs can't have because of mycotoxins, etc. And from the way I see the world, I believe that proteins from poultry is necessary. But you mentioned industrial poultry, and my question is, A, do you think we need, or do you think that grass-fed animals and vegetables is enough to make sure we don't get a protein sufficiency globally? And also, do you believe it is possible to have poultry production that isn't in the bracket of industrial? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think it's really an important one, actually, because the way I pitched it, it sounded as if we all had to never eat a chicken again, and I don't think that's right. And when I was a child in the 50s and 60s, we used to have chicken about once a month, and it was a treat, and an expensive treat. And it was delicious. And I believe that there is a role for properly nourished, sustainably nourished poultry and pigs into the future. But I think you put your finger on the way in which that can happen. The poultry and the pigs ought to be fed on non-human edible byproducts and wastes. And if that happens, and it's done in an ethical way, preferably pastured where possible, I think that is the future for poultry production. And once again, we, as the people who eat the chickens, need to be empowered to differentiate between the chickens which are part of the problem and those which are part of the solution. And just another word on grain. The reason why we are all addicted, those of us that are, to cheap chicken, and it's so unbelievably cheap, is not just because we bred chickens that grow to maturity in 37 days or something terrible like that, but it's also because the grain is so cheap. But the grain isn't really cheap. To produce a crop of wheat or barley or oats in a sustainable way is ecologically quite an expensive process. It's just that when we've had all this Roundup to spray on the land and kill all the soil life, and fertilizers which can produce vast yields at the expense of the soil, it appears cheap, but it isn't really. That's another hidden cost of industrial food. So in an ecological system applied to the United Kingdom, grain production would reduce by 50%. And that would mean that the only grain which would be available for chickens and pigs would be that which is unsuitable in one way or another for human consumption. But I think you make an important point. There is a role for poultry. We don't have to give it up altogether. We just have to re-ascribe a higher value to the meat of that kind that we do eat.
Brilliant, thank you. Next up, we have Toby Anstruther. Hi, Toby.
Hi. I think my questions have been answered really, but I did also ask about economic nutrition and whether it's important or how important you think it is to share where the money goes as food moves down. At the moment, so little money actually goes back to the farmer, and it's very opaque to the consumer where their money goes when they buy food. And I wonder whether you've looked at work to try and improve that transparency.
Yes, I completely agree with you. When I was at the Soil Association, I was involved with developing the organic standards and the organic market. And a lot of the people that were certified organic who were growing for us were also fair trade. And they came to us and they said, couldn't you combine the two certification schemes, because we're certified twice, and we think that fair trade, meaning the producers getting a fair price for their food, ought to be part of the organic story. So we went to the Fair Trade Foundation and their international body called FLOW, and we said, look, couldn't we do something together? And they said, no, fair trade's about tea, coffee and bananas for peasant farmers in developing countries, not for feather-bedded European farmers like you. And I think that was a mistake that they made, and we decided to just accept their position. I think we should have challenged them, actually. I can say that with benefit of hindsight. But I think the world is now changing. I think fair trade and a fair price for the producer ought to be part of the new conditions for sustainable trade in food, because it is unacceptable the very low percentage of the retail price that farmers receive.
Brilliant, thank you. Next up, we have Asya Brandrup.
Thank you. Sorry, now my video is not working. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm working, not working in food, I'm working in health with WHO. And I was wondering, in the kind of approach you suggest, how do you see the role or potential to link up this whole process with the discussion on sustainable development goals, in particular those about life on land and the environment? And could that be a way forward also to advocate with the government, who is also one of the countries committed to implementing the SDGs?
Yes, I think absolutely. The SDGs are really important. And I think that we need to couple up the SDGs to the farm sustainability metrics that I was describing earlier, so that they're seen as one integrated program. And how fascinating, you must be in an influential position in your work with WHO. So that's really powerful, because it seems to me that probably the most important role of farming is to promote public health. And if you go right back to the origins of the organic movement and the sustainable food movement, they go back to a man called, well, one of the origins was a man called Sir Albert Howard, who was sent out to what is now part of Pakistan, the Hunza Valley, in 1905 at the height of the British Empire, to teach these farmers how to adopt Western methods. And he had the humility to realize when he got there that they knew more about sustainable agriculture than he did. And he called the farmers his professors. And he spent 35 years in India setting up a couple of research stations. And when he got back to England in 1940, he wrote a book called An Agricultural Testament, which was his homage to what he'd learned from the Indian farmers. And basically, the key point of the book was he said that the health of soil, plants, animal, and people is one and an indivisible whole. And if we compromise the health of the soil, we will end up with what he called a C3 population, meaning a population with physically and mentally impaired health. And I think we are seeing that playing out. I think we're part of a vast global feeding trial, which has been playing out really ever since then, where we've industrialized agriculture, we've fed the resulting food to several generations of people, and we're now seeing the health consequences. So I think there's a lot of siloed activity going on in the world at the moment, and we need to think more systemically. And a wonderful partnership would be those who are dealing with public health, having a closer relationship with those who are redesigning agricultural strategy.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we probably have time for one or two more questions. So next up we have Christina, parent AC 2019.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
yes, thank you.
Yes, we're working in the Netherlands at a local food initiative, and I was wondering, could you elaborate a little bit more on the citizens-led food systems? What would that look like? And also specifically, how could we connect internationally?
Well, I think that you've heard of community-supported agriculture, which is a term that was originated in Germany, actually, in northern Germany, which is now a global movement where groups of families and citizens form a kind of umbilical link to a farm and commit themselves to purchase its products. And there's the project that my daughter Alice works for, Growing Communities in North London. They have this wonderful idea of connecting peri-urban farms to the people who buy the food in farmers' markets and box schemes and that sort of thing, so that the farmer forms a forward contract with the community, in this case Growing Communities, to grow and supply all their food to that particular committed community of buyers. I think that is an incredible model that we could build on, because in a way that is food security made flesh. You know, it's about knowing the farmer that is producing your food, he or she is there for you and you are there for them as well. And the pricing can be agreed in advance so that the farmer knows where they are, and so does the person who buys the food. And if you supply food directly in that way, you can cut out a lot of the costs which are associated with the profiteering by the food industry. So I think that is one way forward. As regards international collaboration, I've got quite a lot to do with, well, I was in Holland quite recently in relation to our Harmony project, which involves the Prince of Wales and an education initiative, which Peter Howe is familiar with. And we're working with a man called Richard Dunn, who's working in Holland, and I went out there with him. I also know a chap called Volkert Engelsman, who runs an organization called AOSTA, which is a big supplier of organic and biodynamic vegetables, not just in Holland, because of course the Dutch are traders. And if Volkert was listening to this, he'd say, yes, trade is important, because he's a Dutch trader. But I think international collaboration over all these issues is absolutely vital. So do get in touch with me if I can help.
Brilliant. Awesome. And with our final question today, Sheila Fletcher.
Hi. Thanks for that. And right at the beginning, you said that you'd had success with working with the Welsh government. But having described what you've said about the agriculture bill, where do you feel there's any hope with the government here, the current government, to take on any of these ideas?
Do you mean here, in England?
Yes.
Well, yes. I can't say that I think that I don't think the Prime Minister completely gets some of what I've been saying. Although, funnily enough, his dad, Stanley Johnson, who I know, absolutely does. So that maybe Boris needs to listen to his dad a bit more. But in my view, the thing about politicians is they only really want one thing, and that's to get re-elected. And, you know, if there's pressure from the electorate, then the politicians will reflect that. So I think the reason for hope in all this is that I believe that there are certain times in human history when the conditions are right for a big change of consciousness. I think I was lucky enough to be around in the late 60s when that happened. And I believe that this is another time. It's hard to say what causes these changes, but I think there's an openness now. Do you know the Yeats poem, The Second Coming, which really describes the sort of preconditions for a big change? And I think now is that time. I think COVID has been one of the sort of contributory factors. I think we're on the edge of a massive change, and I think it's an unstoppable force for change that's pushing it along. So even though you could be a bit depressed by the people who are running the government at the moment, George Eustice is the DEPRA secretary, but I think he's really, you know, he's not got much power. It's Boris that's got the power, and Boris just wants to make a free trade agreement. I think that those politicians are going to be swept away by this need to build more secure and transparent and sustainable food systems. So I think there's huge cause for optimism. And I think there are millions of people who, if they get this information, will be part of that change.
Brilliant, thank you. So I think that's, in terms of questions, all we have time for today. If anyone has any sort of further questions or we didn't get a chance to respond to any of them, we'll be able to share them with Patrick after. And if he has a chance, we'll be sharing the responses on Atlantic Connect or on other platforms. But just want to say thank you for taking the time, Patrick. It's a really great talk. As you can see, a lot of people had a lot of questions, so it opens up a great discourse. For sort of anyone that's joined, thank you again for coming. We hope you enjoyed these. And moving forward for the next few weeks, they'll be every Thursday, but we'll share more information about the upcoming ones shortly. We'll be sending out sort of a feedback form. So if you have any sort of thoughts, or if you're interested in speaking or know anyone which might be, do let us know. But yeah, we hope you enjoyed it. Keep coming. They're going to keep going. Thank you again, Patrick. It's really lovely to have you. And yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, everyone. It's lovely to feel connected with you all. I feel very proud to be connected with the AC and the UWC community. It makes me feel hopeful.
Brilliant, thank you. It's great to have you, and we hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully we'll see all of you next week. Thanks a lot.